They say humans are the only species in the galaxy stupid enough to charge into certain death for strangers. The Galactic Council called it primitive. The Zephyrian Empire labeled it inefficient. The ancient Vorthan Collective dismissed it as emotional weakness. They were all wrong. What they mistook for stupidity was actually humanity's greatest weapon, a willingness to sacrifice everything, not for glory, not for conquest, but for something far more dangerous, hope. And when Sergeant Marcus Chen was declared lost on the blood-soaked fields of Kepler 442b, surrounded by the corpses of his squad and facing down an entire Xerian war fleet, the galaxy was about to learn why humans had never truly lost a war. Some victories are measured in territory gained, others in enemies destroyed. But the greatest victories are measured in how many tomorrows you create for those who will never see them. This is the story of the day one human's death taught the universe that humanity's true strength isn't in their ability to survive. It's in their refusal to let others face extinction alone. The crimson sun of Kepler 442b cast long shadows across the scorched battlefield, painting the alien landscape in shades of dried blood. Sergeant Marcus Chen pressed his back against the twisted remains of what had once been a Terran defense turret, his breathing ragged as he checked his ammunition counter. 7 rounds left in his plasma rifle. 3 grenades on his belt. Against an entire Xerian invasion fleet, it might as well have been nothing. The silence was deafening. 6 hours ago, this valley had echoed with the thunder of artillery, the screams of dying soldiers, and the alien war cries of the Xerian shock troops. Now only the distant hum of enemy aircraft remained, circling like mechanical vultures over the carnage below. Marcus's squad, 12 of the finest soldiers the Terran Defense Force had ever produced, lay scattered around him in various stages of destruction. Their sacrifice had bought the civilian evacuation ships perhaps 20 minutes. In the grand scheme of the war, it was nothing. To the families now safely aboard those vessels, it was everything. Marcus activated his comm unit, knowing the gesture was futile. The Xerians had been jamming all frequencies since the initial assault, but protocol demanded he try to establish contact with command. Static filled his earpiece, broken only by the occasional burst of alien chatter as the enemy coordinated their final sweep of the battlefield. They were being thorough, these insectoid warriors. Every human body received a confirming blast from their biodisruptors, ensuring no possibility of survival. The young sergeant closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of grief for his fallen comrades. Rodriguez, who had saved 17 civilians during the evacuation of New Mumbai. Tanaka, whose quick thinking had prevented a chemical weapon deployment on Proxima Station. Williams, barely 19, who had joined the TDF to honor her grandfather's memory. They deserved better than this forgotten valley on a world most humans couldn't pronounce. They deserved to go home. A metallic scraping sound drew Marcus from his reverie. Through a gap in the wreckage, he spotted a trio of Xerian scouts advancing in formation, their 6 legs carrying them with unsettling grace over the rough terrain. Each stood roughly 8 feet tall, their chitinous exoskeletons gleaming like polished obsidian in the dying light. Neural interface ports along their elongated skulls pulsed with bioluminescent data as they shared tactical information through their hive network. They were beautiful in a terrifying way. Evolution had crafted them into perfect killers. Marcus had studied Xerian physiology during his training. Unlike humans, they felt no individual fear, no personal ambition, no concept of self-sacrifice for abstract ideals. Every action was calculated for maximum efficiency toward their species' expansion. They had conquered 47 star systems in the past decade through this cold, logical approach to warfare. No emotion, no hesitation, no mercy. The lead scout paused near the corpse of Private Hendricks, extending a sensory appendage to confirm the kill. Marcus watched as the creature's mandibles clicked together in what might have been satisfaction. These beings didn't understand concepts like honor or courage. To them, the human defense of this worthless rock was simply inefficient resource allocation. They couldn't comprehend why 12 soldiers would choose certain death to save a handful of civilian transports. That fundamental misunderstanding, Marcus realized, might be their weakness. The sergeant checked his weapon one final time and began moving through the wreckage with practiced stealth. His enhanced combat suit automatically adjusted its camouflage to match the surrounding debris, rendering him nearly invisible to conventional sensors. The Xerians relied heavily on thermal imaging and bioelectric detection, but Marcus had learned tricks during the siege of Tau Ceti that their technology couldn't account for. Human unpredictability had saved his life more times than superior firepower ever could. As he maneuvered closer to the enemy patrol, Marcus's mind wandered to the intelligence briefings he'd received before deployment. The Xerians weren't just conquering human worlds, they were systematically exterminating every sapient species they encountered. The peaceful Draknori had been reduced from billions to a few thousand refugees. The proud Centauran warrior clans had fallen in less than a year. Dozens of civilizations, each with their own cultures, histories, and dreams, had been erased as if they never existed. The galaxy was dying, one world at a time, and the various species' inability to truly cooperate was accelerating their extinction. Each race fought alone, fell alone, and was forgotten alone. The Galactic Council still held meetings and passed resolutions, but they were like children playing government while their house burned down around them. Marcus reached an optimal firing position behind a fallen communications array. The 3 scouts were now spread across a 30-meter area, their attention focused on cataloging human casualties for their post-battle reports. Standard Xerian doctrine called for detailed biological sampling to better understand their enemy's capabilities. What they would learn from examining his friends' bodies would make the next human colony more vulnerable. That couldn't happen. The sergeant's finger found the trigger of his plasma rifle as he selected his first target. The leftmost scout had positioned itself near William's body, its sensory apparatus extended to gather tissue samples. One shot would take it down, but the other 2 would immediately triangulate his position and call for reinforcements. In a conventional engagement, he would be dead within minutes. Fortunately, Marcus had stopped thinking conventionally hours ago. Instead of firing, he reached for one of his remaining grenades, an experimental sonic disruptor that the TDF had been field testing against Xerian neural networks. The weapon had shown promise in laboratory conditions, but its effects on actual enemy soldiers remained theoretical. In 30 seconds, Marcus would have concrete data, assuming he lived long enough to appreciate it. He armed the device and hurled it into the center of the enemy formation, then immediately rolled to a new position behind a chunk of reinforced concrete. The grenade detonated with a sound like reality tearing, sending out waves of precisely calibrated acoustic energy designed to disrupt the quantum resonance frequencies that Xerian brains used for communication. The effect was immediate and dramatic. All 3 scouts collapsed as if their strings had been cut, their limbs twitching erratically as their nervous systems struggled to process conflicting sensory data. For perhaps 10 seconds they were completely vulnerable, separated from their hive mind, and unable to coordinate their actions. Marcus used those 10 seconds well. 3 plasma bursts eliminated the disoriented aliens before they could recover. But he knew the victory was temporary. Their sudden disconnection from the hive network would be noticed quickly, and a full squadron would arrive to investigate. He had perhaps 5 minutes before this valley became untenable, time enough to send a message. The sergeant sprinted toward the wreckage of the human command post, where the emergency broadcast array might still be functional. If he could splice into the Xerian communication network using the Scout's neural interfaces, he might be able to transmit a warning to the remaining human colonies about the invasion fleet's true size and capabilities. The aliens had been using sophisticated deception protocols to mask their numbers, making each target believe they faced a manageable threat until it was too late. Marcus reached the communications equipment and began the delicate process of jury-rigging a connection to one of the fallen scouts. The creature's bioelectric field was still active, its neural ports cycling through security protocols as they attempted to reconnect with the hive mind. With careful manipulation, he could piggyback a human signal onto those automated reconnection attempts. As he worked, Marcus became aware of a sound that didn't belong on this dead battlefield: the high-pitched whine of civilian transport engines. Through the smoke and haze, he caught a glimpse of a small vessel descending toward the valley floor. Not a rescue ship. The approaching craft bore the insignia of the Kepler 442 Medical Corp. Someone was coming back for the wounded. Marcus felt his heart sink as he recognized the impossible bravery and stupidity of the gesture. The medical team obviously believed some of his squad might still be alive, and they were risking everything for the chance to save even one soldier. It was exactly the kind of irrational human behavior that had confounded their enemies throughout the war. It was also going to get them all killed. The transport was already taking fire from automated Xerion defense platforms as it approached. Its shields flared and sparked under the assault, but the pilot maintained course with grim determination. Marcus could see through the cockpit viewport a young woman in medical corps uniform, her face set with absolute resolve as she fought to bring her ship down safely among the carnage. She was going to die for nothing. The valley was already crawling with Xerion reinforcements responding to the loss of their scouts. Within minutes, this entire area would be swarming with hostiles. The medical team would be captured or killed, and their transport would become another trophy for the enemy's collection. Unless Marcus did something characteristically human, something completely, utterly, magnificently stupid. He abandoned his work on the communication array and began running toward the landing zone, activating his suit's emergency beacon as he moved. If he could draw the Xerion forces toward his position, the medical team might have enough time to realize their mistake and escape. One life for several. The mathematics of heroism. The transport touched down roughly 50 meters from his position, its engines still spinning as the crew prepared for a rapid evacuation. Marcus could see two figures in medical gear emerging from the craft, along with a pilot who remained at the controls. Brave people, all of them. People who deserve to see tomorrow. Xerion aircraft were already converging on the valley from multiple directions. The enemy had realized that something significant was happening in this supposedly secured area, and they were responding with overwhelming force. Marcus counted at least 12 attack craft in the first wave, with more appearing on the horizon every moment. He activated his final 2 grenades and lobbed them at the nearest Xerion ground forces, creating a temporary diversion as he sprinted across the open ground toward the medical transport. Plasma fire erupted around him, turning the air into a deadly light show as multiple enemies acquired his position. His armor's defensive systems screamed warnings about incoming projectiles and energy weapons, but Marcus ignored them all. His only focus was reaching that transport and getting it airborne before the enemy closed the trap completely. The medical team spotted him approaching and began waving frantically for him to hurry. They had no idea they were watching a dead man run toward them. Marcus Chen had been declared lost on this battlefield the moment his squad made their final stand. What happened next would determine whether his death meant something or nothing. As he reached the transport's loading ramp, Marcus made a decision that would echo through history. Instead of climbing aboard, he turned to face the approaching enemy forces and raised his plasma rifle. The medical team shouted for him to get inside, but he shook his head and pointed skyward. The mathematics of heroism demanded that some people go home. Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the medical transport's rear viewport, watching helplessly as Sergeant Chen disappeared into a wall of plasma fire. The human soldier had pushed them up the loading ramp with his own hands, shouting orders for immediate takeoff even as Xerion shock troops closed in from 3 directions. The last thing she saw before the smoke obscured her view was Chen dropping into a defensive position behind a piece of wreckage, his rifle already tracking targets with mechanical precision. The transport lurched skyward as Pilot Lieutenant James Morrison pushed the engines beyond their safety limits. Warning klaxons filled the passenger compartment as the overloaded craft struggled to gain altitude while dodging incoming fire. Morrison's voice crackled through the internal comm system, tight with concentration and barely controlled panic. "Medical Bay, we've got company. Count 12 bogies closing fast and our shields are down to 30%. Whatever that soldier did down there, it's got every Xerion in the sector wanting us dead."
Elena exchanged glances with her partner, Medic First Class David Kim, who was strapping himself into an acceleration couch with practiced efficiency.
Both had volunteered for the rescue mission despite knowing the odds were astronomical. Intelligence reports indicated that no human forces remained alive in the contested zone, but Medical Corps doctrine demanded they verify the status of fallen soldiers whenever possible. Sometimes, impossibly, people survived things that should have killed them. This time, they had been right. And wrong, they had found one survivor only to watch him sacrifice himself to ensure their escape. The transport's defensive systems engaged automatically as Zerian fighters closed to attack range. Elena felt the deck vibrate beneath her feet as the craft's single-point defense laser attempted to ward off incoming missiles. It was like fighting a battleship with a flashlight, but Morrison was doing everything possible to buy them time to reach the safety of the orbital defense perimeter. Through the viewport, Elena could see the battlefield shrinking below them, but her enhanced optical implants kept Chen's position in focus even at increasing distance. The sergeant was still moving, still fighting, somehow staying ahead of the converging enemy forces through a combination of tactical brilliance and what appeared to be supernatural luck. Every time the Zerians thought they had him cornered, he would emerge from an unexpected angle to strike at their flanks before vanishing into the wreckage again. "That's impossible," Kim muttered, watching the same display. No human can outmaneuver an entire Zerion battalion. Their coordination algorithms should have eliminated him in the first 30 seconds. Elena nodded absently, but her medical training was picking up details that pure military analysis might miss. Chen's movements weren't random or desperate. They followed a pattern that suggested he was deliberately drawing the enemy into specific positions. Each time he engaged a Zerion unit, their response pulled additional forces away from other tactical objectives. He was buying time, but not for his own survival. The doctor activated her comm unit and began recording an encrypted message for transmission to Terran Defense Command. If they didn't survive the next few minutes, someone needed to document what they had witnessed. Medical Corps Transport 77 Alpha 2 TDF Command. We have evacuated the Kepler 442 battlefield and can confirm the status of Sergeant Marcus Chen, previously listed as missing in action. Sergeant Chen is alive and engaging superior enemy forces to ensure our safe extraction. His tactical actions have drawn significant Zerian resources away from other operational areas. Recommend immediate analysis of enemy response patterns for intelligence value. She paused, considering how to properly convey what she was seeing. Military reports demanded objective language, but what was happening on the surface below transcended normal tactical categories. Sergeant Chen's actions represent an extraordinary example of human tactical adaptability under extreme conditions. His ability to disrupt Zerian coordination protocols suggests that our enemy's reliance on hive mind networking may represent an exploitable weakness rather than an insurmountable advantage. Recommend further study? The transport shuddered as a near miss from a Zerian plasma cannon overloaded their starboard stabilizers. Morrison's voice cut through the alarm signals with characteristic calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching the edge of the atmosphere, but we're not out of the woods yet. Those fighters are gaining on us, and our acceleration curve isn't going to cut it for much longer. I'm going to try something that's either brilliant or suicidal, and I won't know which until we're all either safe or dead." Elena felt her stomach lurch as Morrison threw the transport into a steep climbing turn that brought them dangerously close to one of the planet's small moons. The maneuver was using the celestial body's gravity well to slingshot them toward the outer system. But it also meant flying through a debris field that would challenge even the most experienced pilot. Chunks of ice and rock began hammering against their hull as they threaded the needle between gravitational death and enemy fire. Below them, the battle continued to rage around Chen's position. Elena's enhanced vision could still track individual plasma bursts as the lone human continued his impossible dance with death. The Zerian forces had committed nearly 2 full battalions to his elimination, which represented a massive diversion of resources from their primary invasion objectives. Whatever the sergeant was doing, it was forcing the enemy to react rather than dictate the battle's flow. Kim, are you seeing this tactical pattern? Elena pointed to her display where tracking algorithms were highlighting the movement of Zirion units across the battlefield. Look at their deployment sequence. Every time Chen engages a forward unit, they pull reinforcements from their rear echelons. He's not just buying us time, he's teaching us how to fight them. The medics studied the data with growing excitement. You're right. They're treating him as a critical threat that must be eliminated immediately, even though logic says one human can't possibly threaten their mission objectives. Their hive mind is optimized for efficiency, but it can't account for tactically irrational behavior. Elena began rapidly documenting the enemy response patterns in her medical log, knowing that this information could save countless lives in future engagements. Human forces had been losing battle after battle because they tried to fight the Zirions using conventional tactics against an enemy that had evolved beyond conventional thinking. But Chen was demonstrating something different, a way to exploit the aliens' greatest strength by turning it into a weakness. The transport finally cleared the debris field and began accelerating toward the safety of the outer orbital stations. Behind them, the Zirion fighters had given up pursuit rather than risk damage in the treacherous gravitational environment. Morrison's gamble had paid off, but Elena felt no relief as she watched Kepler 442 shrinking behind them. Somewhere on that world, a human soldier was still fighting against impossible odds. Dr. Vasquez, we're receiving a priority transmission from TDF Command, Morrison announced. They're ordering us to the medical station at Luna Point for immediate debriefing. Apparently, our little rescue mission has attracted some high-level attention. Elena wasn't surprised. The Terran Defense Force had been searching for any tactical advantage that might slow the Zirion advance, and their accidental discovery of an exploitable weakness in enemy coordination protocols would be considered invaluable intelligence. Chen's sacrifice was about to become much more than a heroic last stand. It was going to change how humanity fought the war. As the transport entered hyperspace for the journey to Luna Point, Elena made a personal decision that would have far-reaching consequences. She activated her personal communication array and began composing a message to her contacts in the medical research community. The Zirion hive mind represented a type of consciousness that human science had only theorized about, and Chen's battle was providing unprecedented data about how such systems responded to unexpected stimuli. If humanity was going to survive this war, they needed to understand their enemy better than ever before, and that understanding would require bringing together the best minds from every field: military strategists, xenobiologists, consciousness researchers, and tactical psychologists. The war wasn't just about superior firepower anymore. It had become a contest between different types of intelligence, different ways of understanding reality itself. Dr. Elena Vasquez began writing the most important research proposal of her career, requesting authorization to establish the first joint species consciousness research initiative in galactic history. Her argument was simple. If one human soldier could disrupt an entire Zirion coordination network through tactical unpredictability, imagine what an alliance of species could accomplish by combining their different approaches to problem solving. The proposal would eventually reach the Galactic Council, where it would be dismissed by most delegates as human wishful thinking. But a few representatives from desperate civilizations would see its potential. The Draknari refugees, the surviving Zentauran clans, the scattered remnants of a dozen other conquered peoples, they all understood that conventional resistance had failed. It was time to try something completely different, something characteristically human, something that the Zirions would never see coming. Meanwhile, on the surface of Kepler 442, Marcus Chen was discovering that sometimes the most important victories happen after everyone thinks you're already dead. The Zirion forces surrounding his position had grown increasingly frustrated as their numerical superiority failed to produce the expected result. Their hive mind was beginning to reassess its tactical algorithms, questioning assumptions that had served them well for decades of conquest. For the first time in their species' military history, the Zirions were learning to doubt themselves, and doubt, as any human could tell you, is the first step toward defeat. The sergeant checked his ammunition counter one final time and smiled grimly. 0 rounds remaining, but his mission was far from over. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the one that kills your enemy, it's the one that teaches them to kill themselves. Marcus Chen was about to give the galaxy its first lesson in human improvisation. 3 standard months after the Kepler-42 incident, the emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in the massive spherical chamber orbiting the neutral world of Sanctuary Prime. Representatives from 47 species filled the tiered seating arrangements, their various atmospheric requirements accommodated by individual environmental pods. The air hummed with tension as delegates discussed the most significant shift in the war's trajectory since the Xerian advance had begun. Ambassador Thysia of the Draknari delegation activated her translation matrix and addressed the assembly with barely contained urgency. Her species had been reduced from 6 billion individuals to fewer than 2 million refugees scattered across a dozen worlds, making her one of the few survivors who could speak from direct experience about Xerion tactics. Honored delegates, the intelligence data we have received from human sources represents our first genuine opportunity to understand our enemy's psychological vulnerabilities. For 18 months, we have watched species after species fall to Xerian forces because we insisted on fighting them as if they were merely another conventional military threat. The events on Kepler 442 prove that their greatest strength can become their greatest weakness. A ripple of skeptical chittering arose from the hegemony of Keth delegation. Their representative, a crystalline being whose thoughts manifested as colored lights within their transparent body, pulsed with patterns indicating profound doubt. The humans present theories based on a single engagement involving one isolated soldier. This council has reviewed thousands of tactical analyses that suggest no fundamental weakness in Xerian coordination protocols. We should not restructure our defensive strategies based on what may have been an anomalous incident. Human Admiral Sarah Chen, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname, stood at her delegation's podium with the bearing of someone who had spent the past months studying every frame of combat footage from her distant colleague's final battle. Her uniform bore the insignia of the newly formed Multi-Species Tactical Research Division, an organization that existed only because Dr. Elena Vasquez's proposal had found unexpected support among the most desperate civilizations. With respect to the Keth delegation, we are not dealing with anomalous data. Over the past 12 weeks, human forces have successfully field-tested the tactical principles derived from Sergeant Chen's engagement. We have documented 7 separate incidents where small human units disrupted major Xerian operations by exploiting their coordination protocols' inability to process tactically irrational behavior. Admiral Chen activated a holographic display that filled the chamber center with a 3-dimensional representation of recent battle data. The images showed human soldiers engaging Xerian forces in ways that violated every principle of conventional military doctrine, charging directly into superior firepower, abandoning defensible positions to attack enemy strongholds, and sacrificing tactical advantages to protect civilians with no strategic value. In every case, the results were consistent. Xerian forces became increasingly focused on eliminating the irrational human elements, even when doing so required them to abandon more important objectives. Their hive mind interprets tactically inexplicable behavior as a critical threat that must be neutralized immediately. The Vorthan Collective Representative, an ancient entity whose consciousness existed as a distributed network across multiple biomechanical bodies, spoke in harmonized voices that created complex acoustic patterns in the chamber's atmosphere. The humans described deliberate irrationality as if it were a viable military strategy. This council has observed human tactical doctrine for decades, and we have consistently noted their species' tendency toward self-destructive heroics. What evidence suggests that this behavioral pattern represents intentional exploitation of enemy weaknesses rather than simply characteristic human inefficiency? Dr. Elena Vasquez, now serving as Chief Science Advisor to the Multi-Species Research Initiative, stepped forward to address the challenge. Her months of work with the surviving members of various conquered civilizations had taught her to speak in terms that different species could understand, despite their radically different approaches to logic and reasoning. Honored Collective, we have been studying Xerian neural architecture with assistance from refugee populations who have observed their conquerors at close range. Their hive mind operates on principles of optimization that assume all sapient behavior serves rational strategic purposes. When they encounter actions that appear to contradict this assumption, their coordination algorithms become trapped in recursive analysis loops while attempting to identify the hidden logic. The doctor activated her own set of displays, showing detailed scans of Xerion brain tissue obtained from battlefield casualties. The images revealed neural pathways that formed incredibly complex networks, but with specific structural limitations that had never been identified before human researchers began studying them with fresh perspectives. The Xerions have evolved beyond individual consciousness in pursuit of perfect collective efficiency. But this evolution has created a blind spot in their cognitive architecture. They literally cannot comprehend behavior that prioritizes abstract concepts like honor, mercy, or self-sacrifice over tactical advantage. When they encounter such behavior, they assume it must be part of a more sophisticated strategy that they have failed to identify. Ambassador Thysia leaned forward in her environmental pod, her scaled features displaying the intense concentration that her species exhibited when processing critical information. Vasquez, are you suggesting that the Xerian hive mind's greatest evolutionary achievement has made them vulnerable to species that have retained individual consciousness? The human scientist nodded grimly. That's exactly what I'm suggesting, and Sergeant Chen proved it. His final engagement lasted nearly 6 hours because the Xerian forces couldn't accept that one human would continue fighting purely to save people he had never met. Their command algorithms kept searching for the rational strategic purpose behind his actions, and this analysis paralysis prevented them from implementing effective countermeasures. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of species-specific communication methods as delegates processed the implications. For years, various civilizations had viewed their retention of individual consciousness as a weakness compared to the Xerions' perfect collective coordination. The possibility that this apparent disadvantage might actually represent a strategic asset was forcing fundamental reassessments of military doctrine across dozens of worlds. Admiral Chen waited for the discussion to settle before presenting her next revelation. There's more. Based on our analysis of Sergeant Chen's tactical patterns, we have developed preliminary protocols for what we're calling consciousness warfare. The goal is not to defeat Xerian forces through superior firepower, but to overwhelm their coordination networks by presenting them with tactical puzzles they cannot solve. She manipulated the holographic display to show theoretical battle scenarios where mixed species units employed deliberately contradictory strategies. Human soldiers would engage in seemingly suicidal charges, while Draknari warriors employed their species' characteristic patience to maintain defensive positions indefinitely. Zentaran hunters would abandon tactical advantages to protect wounded enemies, while Keth crystal beings would sacrifice valuable equipment to preserve abstract artistic creations. Each species contributes behaviors that the Xerian hive mind cannot rationalize within their optimization framework. The cumulative effect is cognitive overload that degrades their coordination efficiency exponentially. The hegemony of Keth representative pulsed with patterns indicating deep skepticism mixed with grudging interest. The humans propose that we abandon proven tactical doctrines in favor of actions that appear militarily counterproductive. How do we measure success in conflicts where victory depends on intentional irrationality? Vasquez exchanged a meaningful look with Admiral Chen before responding to the question. Both women had spent months studying not just Xerion weaknesses but the strengths of the various refugee populations who had witnessed their civilization's destruction. Each species had survived their encounters with the enemy by retaining some essential characteristic that the hive mind couldn't understand or predict. Success is measured by survival, honored delegate. Every species in this chamber has qualities that the Xerians cannot comprehend because they abandoned those qualities during their own evolution. The Draknari's willingness to endure suffering for spiritual growth. the Centaurian concept of honor that transcends tactical advantage, the Vorthan collective's ability to sacrifice individual components for artistic expression, even the Keth dedication to preserving beauty regardless of practical utility. The doctor paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the most important point of her presentation. The Xerians conquered our worlds by exploiting our tendency to fight as separate species with incompatible goals, but they made a critical error in their calculations. They assumed that consciousness diversity was a weakness rather than a strength. Sergeant Chen's sacrifice taught us that our differences aren't obstacles to overcome, they're weapons to deploy. The chamber fell silent as delegates contemplated the strategic implications. For the first time since the war began, they were discussing offensive operations rather than defensive evacuations. The possibility of actually defeating the Xerion advance seemed almost too incredible to consider, but the tactical data was undeniable. Ambassador Thysia was the first to break the silence. Dr. Vasquez, if we agree to implement these consciousness warfare protocols, what do you estimate our chances of success? The human scientist looked around the chamber, taking in the desperate hope visible in dozens of different physiological expressions. These beings represented the scattered remnants of once great civilizations united only by their shared experience of loss and their determination to prevent further extinctions. "Unknown," she replied honestly. "We're proposing to fight a war using strategies that have never been tested on this scale. We're asking every species to embrace behaviors that may seem contradictory to their survival instincts. We're betting everything on the theory that consciousness diversity represents an evolutionary advantage rather than a tactical liability. But we know what happens if we continue fighting conventionally. We've watched 47 species fall to the Xerian advance, and our projections suggest that all remaining civilizations will be eliminated within 5 standard years. The choice isn't between a safe strategy and a risky one. The choice is between trying something unprecedented and accepting extinction." The vote that followed was closer than either human had hoped, but when the final tallies were announced, 31 species had agreed to participate in the Consciousness Warfare Initiative. It wasn't a unanimous mandate, but it was enough to begin the most ambitious military experiment in galactic history. As the delegates prepared to return to their respective worlds with news of the decision, Dr. Vasquez activated a private communication link to the memorial station orbiting Earth. The message was addressed to no one in particular, but she felt the need to share this moment with the memory of the soldier whose sacrifice had made it all possible. Sergeant Marcus Chen declared lost on the battlefield of Kepler-2, "Sir, your final engagement has been classified as the single most strategically significant action in recorded military history. The galaxy is about to learn what it means to fight like humans. We thought you might want to know." The message disappeared into the quantum communication network, carrying hope toward a small memorial plaque that bore a simple inscription. "He taught the universe that some things are worth dying for, and some things are worth living for, and wisdom lies in knowing the difference." The first consciousness warfare engagement took place in the Rigel sector, where Xerian forces had established a staging area for their next phase of galactic conquest. The target was perfect for testing the new tactical doctrine, a heavily fortified world with strategic importance but minimal civilian population to complicate the mission parameters. Success here would prove the viability of the protocol. Failure would likely result in the complete destruction of the multi-species task force. Commander Zara Okafor of the Terran Defense Force stood on the bridge of the hybrid cruiser Synthesis, watching as the most unusual fleet in military history prepared for combat. Draknari meditation ships floated alongside Zentoran hunter-killers, while Keth crystalline vessels reflected starlight in patterns that seemed to dance with artistic purpose rather than tactical efficiency. Human warships anchored the formation, their crews trained in the art of strategic irrationality that had been refined through months of simulation and drill. The Xerian defenders numbered approximately 50,000 ground troops, supported by a full battle fleet of 200 vessels. Under conventional tactical analysis, the Allied force of 12,000 mixed-species soldiers and 37 ships should have been annihilated within hours. But conventional analysis had failed to account for the psychological weapons that consciousness diversity could deploy. "All vessels report ready for engagement," announced Lieutenant Morrison, the same pilot who had extracted Dr. Vasquez from Kepler 442 and now served as the fleet's coordination specialist. His voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had learned to trust in the power of human unpredictability. Draknari meditation formations are achieving optimal spiritual resonance. Zentauran hunter packs are prepared for honor-seeking charges. Keth artistic preservation units are ready to protect beauty regardless of tactical cost. Commander Okafor nodded as she reviewed the mission parameters one final time. The consciousness warfare doctrine didn't aim to defeat the enemy through superior firepower or strategic positioning. Instead, it sought to create cognitive overload in the Xerian hive mind by presenting tactical scenarios that violated every principle of rational military behavior. Dr. Vasquez, are you reading stable neural patterns from the enemy coordination network? Okafor asked, addressing the scientist who had become the military's leading expert on Xerian psychology. The doctor studied her displays with intense concentration, monitoring the bioelectric signatures that indicated hive mind activity levels. "Commander, their coordination algorithms are operating at normal efficiency. They've identified our force composition and calculated a 97% probability of victory within 6 hours. They have no indication that we're about to deploy weapons they cannot comprehend." Okafor activated the fleet-wide communication system, preparing to give the most unusual battle orders in military history. "All units initiate consciousness warfare protocols. Remember, victory depends not on achieving tactical objectives, but on forcing the enemy to question the fundamental assumptions that drive their decision-making processes. Make them doubt the efficiency of their own evolution." The engagement began with a Zentauran charge that violated every principle of sound military doctrine. 3 hunter-killer vessels broke formation and accelerated directly toward the center of the Xerian battle line, ignoring the concentrated fire that should have vaporized them within moments. But instead of employing evasive maneuvers or defensive countermeasures, the Zentauran ships began broadcasting their warriors' death songs on all frequencies, proclaiming their intention to die with honor rather than achieve victory through cautious tactics. The Xerian response was immediate and predictable. They concentrated overwhelming firepower on the charging vessels, treating them as the primary threat that required immediate neutralization. Within minutes, 2 of the 3 Zentauran ships had been destroyed, but their sacrifice had drawn the enemy fleet into an aggressive formation that exposed their flanks to follow-up attacks, except no follow-up attacks came. Instead, the Draknari meditation ships began an entirely different kind of assault. They moved into position near the debris field where the Zentauran warriors had fallen and began broadcasting emotional resonance patterns designed to honor the dead through collective spiritual reflection. The massive vessels, each capable of devastating offensive capability, simply stopped fighting and started mourning. Dr. Vasquez monitored the Xerian neural patterns with growing excitement as confusion began spreading through their coordination network. "Commander, their hive mind is attempting to analyze the tactical purpose of the Draknari morning ritual. They're allocating increasing computational resources to understanding why military assets would voluntarily remove themselves from combat to honor fallen enemies. The Keth crystalline vessels chose that moment to begin their own contribution to the consciousness warfare protocol. Their ships broke away from all tactical formations and began arranging themselves into complex geometric patterns that served no military purpose whatsoever. The crystal beings were creating art in the middle of a space battle, transforming their warships into components of a massive 3-dimensional sculpture that reflected starlight in ways that defied rational explanation. Commander Okafor watched the enemy's response with professional admiration for the tactical principles that Sergeant Chen had discovered through desperate improvisation. The Xerian fleet was becoming increasingly focused on understanding the irrational behavior patterns rather than implementing effective countermeasures. Their coordination algorithms were trapped in recursive analysis loops, trying to identify the hidden strategic purpose behind actions that had no strategic purpose beyond their own incomprehensibility. Human squadrons, initiate Chen protocol activation, Okafor ordered, naming the tactical maneuver after the soldier whose sacrifice had revealed its effectiveness. The human ships began the most suicidal charge in their species' military history. Unlike the honor-seeking Zentoran assault, the human attack had no noble purpose or spiritual significance. Human vessels simply accelerated toward the enemy formations while broadcasting surrender requests, distress calls, and detailed technical specifications for their own weapon systems. They were simultaneously attacking and attempting to defect while revealing classified information to their enemies. The Xerion hive mind experienced something that their species had not felt in millions of years of evolution: complete cognitive paralysis. Their coordination networks could not process tactical scenarios where enemies simultaneously displayed aggression, submission, and betrayal in the same action. Every behavioral prediction algorithm crashed as they attempted to calculate response strategies for impossible contradictions. Dr. Vasquez's instruments registered unprecedented neural activity as the enemy's collective consciousness struggled to comprehend what it was experiencing. Commander, their hive mind is overloading. Neural pathway efficiency is dropping exponentially as they attempt to resolve the contradictions between our actions and their predictive models. The tactical advantage created by consciousness warfare became apparent within minutes. Xerian ships began firing on each other as different segments of the hive mind reached conflicting conclusions about which allied vessels represented the greatest threat. Some enemy units attempted to accept human surrender offers while others tried to destroy the surrendering ships. Several Xerion squadrons broke off from the main engagement to establish protective formations around the Kethart installation, apparently concluding that the geometric patterns must conceal some kind of superweapon. Commander Okafor seized the moment of enemy confusion to implement the mission's actual military objectives. While Xerion forces struggled to understand behaviors they could not rationalize, human engineering teams transported aboard their command vessels and began installing quantum communication disruptors that would prevent the hive mind from coordinating future operations in this sector. The battle concluded not with decisive victory or crushing defeat, but with something far more significant: the first successful demonstration that consciousness diversity could serve as an effective weapon against the galaxy's most efficient military force. The Xerian fleet eventually retreated after suffering minimal casualties but massive psychological damage to their coordination networks. More importantly, their retreat patterns indicated that they were already beginning to doubt the tactical assumptions that had served them throughout decades of conquest. For the first time in their species' military history, the Xerions were questioning whether their evolutionary advantages might actually represent strategic vulnerabilities. As the Allied fleet regrouped after the engagement, Commander Okafor received priority communications from refugee populations throughout the galaxy. Word of the victory was spreading faster than official military reports, carried by quantum communication networks that connected the scattered remnants of conquered civilizations. For the first time in years, the messages contained hope rather than despair. Dr. Vasquez compiled her post-battle analysis with the excitement of a researcher who had witnessed a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare itself. The consciousness warfare protocols had achieved something that conventional military doctrine had declared impossible. They had taught the Xerions to doubt themselves. "Commander, I recommend immediate expansion of the consciousness warfare program," she announced as she submitted her report to the Multi-Species Command Authority. "We have proof that tactical irrationality can disrupt Xerion coordination networks more effectively than any conventional weapon. With proper coordination, we could implement consciousness warfare scenarios across multiple sectors simultaneously." Okafor nodded as she reviewed the tactical data from the engagement. The battle had cost them 3 Zentoran vessels and approximately 40 casualties, while inflicting no significant material damage on enemy forces. By conventional military standards, it should have been classified as an expensive failure. But conventional military standards had failed to account for psychological victories that could alter the strategic balance of an entire war. Vasquez, begin preparation for Phase 2 operations. I want consciousness warfare protocols tested against Xerian occupation forces on contested worlds. If we can teach their hive mind to question its own decisions, we might be able to force them to withdraw from conquered territories without conventional liberation campaigns. As the synthesist entered hyperspace for the return journey to Allied space, its quantum communication arrays transmitted detailed battle reports to every surviving civilization in the galaxy. The reports included tactical analysis, engagement recordings, and a simple message that would echo through history. 442 has taught us that the enemy's greatest strength lies in their inability to understand our greatest weaknesses. Consciousness diversity is not a tactical liability, it is the weapon that will win this war. The message reached the memorial station orbiting Earth, where automated systems added it to the growing collection of reports documenting how one soldier's final battle had changed the course of galactic history. The station's archives now contain thousands of similar messages from dozens of species, all expressing gratitude for a sacrifice that had revealed the path to victory. But the most significant change was taking place in the deep space monitoring stations, where Xerion communication networks could be observed without detection. For the first time since their expansion began, the aliens were transmitting requests for tactical analysis rather than victory reports. Their hive mind was learning to question its own decisions, and doubt was spreading through their collective consciousness like a virus for which their evolution had provided no immunity. The galaxy was beginning to fight back, and the Xerians were learning that perfect efficiency could become perfect vulnerability when confronted by the magnificent chaos of conscious diversity. 2 years after the first consciousness warfare engagement, the galaxy had become unrecognizable. The Xerian Empire, which had once expanded with mechanical precision across dozens of star systems, now found itself contracting as their hive mind struggled with an epidemic of tactical uncertainty that no amount of evolutionary optimization could resolve. The final phase of what historians would later call the Chen Doctrine was about to begin. Fleet Admiral Elena Vasquez, promoted from her previous role as research coordinator, stood in the command center of the massive station that had been constructed around Marcus Chen's memorial plaque. The facility served as headquarters for the Consciousness Warfare Division, where representatives from 63 species worked together to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of psychological warfare against an enemy that had never learned to doubt itself. Through the station's transparent aluminum viewports, Elena could see the largest fleet ever assembled by Allied forces. Over 3,000 vessels representing every surviving civilization in the galaxy hung in formation around the memorial station, their crews trained in tactical irrationality protocols that had been refined through 2 years of successful engagements against Syrian forces. The fleet's composition would have seemed absurd to military strategists from the pre-consciousness warfare era. Draknari meditation ships designed for spiritual contemplation served alongside Zentauran hunter-killers built for glorious battle. Keth crystalline vessels optimized for artistic expression operated in formation with pragmatic human warships that had been retrofitted with weapon systems that made no tactical sense whatsoever. Each species contributed their unique form of incomprehensibility to the greater tactical picture. The Vorthan Collective had developed methods of sacrificing valuable military assets to preserve enemy art installations. The hegemony of Keth had learned to abandon strategically critical positions in order to protect abstract mathematical concepts. Even the traditionally logical Rigelian Federation had embraced protocols that required their commanders to make decisions based on emotional resonance rather than strategic analysis. "Admiral, we're receiving the final coordination signals from the Xerion home system," announced Commander Zara Okafor, who now served as Elena's chief tactical advisor. "Their planetary defense networks are operating at full efficiency, and their coordination algorithms show no indication of the doubt patterns we've been cultivating in their frontier forces."
Elena nodded as she reviewed the intelligence reports that had taken months of preparation to obtain.
The Xerian homeworld represented the ultimate test of consciousness warfare doctrine. Unlike their frontier armies, which had been exposed to psychological warfare for years, the core population of their species maintained the pure hive mind efficiency that had made them the galaxy's most feared conquerors. The final engagement would determine whether consciousness diversity could overcome evolutionary perfection even under ideal conditions for the enemy. Success would effectively end the war by destroying the Zirion species' ability to maintain their collective coordination. Failure would result in the annihilation of every allied force and the completion of their galactic conquest. Dr. Kim, what's the status of our psychological warfare systems? Elena asked, addressing the man who had been her medical partner during that first rescue mission and now served as the division's leading expert on hive mind vulnerabilities. David Kim consulted his displays with the focused intensity of someone who had spent years studying the neural architecture of humanity's greatest enemy. Admiral, our consciousness disruption arrays are operating at optimal parameters. We've synchronized the tactical irrationality patterns of all 63 allied species to create the most comprehensive psychological assault in recorded history. If the Zarian hive mind has any vulnerability to cognitive overload, this engagement will expose it. Elena activated the fleet-wide communication system to address the assembled crews in their native languages, using translation protocols that had been developed specifically for multi-species coordination. The message she was about to deliver had been crafted by linguists, psychologists, and tactical philosophers working together to create words that would inspire conscious beings to embrace their greatest weaknesses as weapons. Crews of the Allied Consciousness Fleet, today we implement the final phase of the Chen Doctrine. In approximately 6 hours, we will engage the Zarian homeworld using tactical principles that would have been considered insane before Sergeant Marcus Chen taught us that insanity can be the most rational strategy against an enemy that has abandoned the possibility of madness. She paused, looking out at the memorial station where a simple plaque commemorated the soldier whose sacrifice had changed everything. We are about to ask each species to display the behaviors that the Zirian evolution discarded in pursuit of perfect efficiency. The Draknari will choose suffering over tactical advantage. The Zentarians will seek death before dishonor. The Keth will preserve beauty at the cost of strategic objectives. Humans will sacrifice themselves for strangers they have never met. The communication arrays carried her words to every vessel in the fleet, translated into thought patterns that each species could understand according to their own cognitive architecture. The response was immediate, a synchronized expression of determination that crossed species barriers and united conscious beings in shared purpose for perhaps the first time in galactic history. The Zirians evolved beyond individual consciousness because they believed it would make them stronger. Today we prove that consciousness diversity isn't a weakness to overcome. It's a strength to celebrate. We fight not just for victory, but for the right of every thinking being to choose their own path through the universe. The fleet began its final approach to the Zirion home system, implementing tactical formations that deliberately violated every principle of sound military doctrine. Human vessels charged directly into the heart of enemy defenses while broadcasting detailed surrender negotiations. Draknari ships abandoned defensive positions to engage in collective mourning for casualties that hadn't occurred yet. Zentorian hunters sought the most dangerous enemy units specifically because defeating them would bring no tactical advantage. The Zirion response revealed the fundamental limitation of their evolutionary path. Their hive mind could process and counter any rational strategy, no matter how complex or sophisticated. But consciousness warfare wasn't rational. It was the weaponization of every quality that evolution should have eliminated: compassion, irrationality, self-sacrifice, artistic expression, spiritual contemplation, and the stubborn refusal to accept that survival required the abandonment of everything that made survival worthwhile. Doctor, Kim monitored the enemy neural patterns with growing excitement as the Zirian coordination networks began displaying unprecedented activity.
Admiral, their hive mind is allocating massive computational resources to understanding our tactical intentions.
They're attempting to identify the strategic logic behind behaviors that have no strategic logic. The battle that followed would be studied by military historians for generations not because of its tactical brilliance but because of its tactical impossibility. Allied forces simultaneously advanced and retreated, attacked and surrendered, sought victory and embraced defeat, all while protecting enemy installations that served no military purpose whatsoever. The Zarian hive mind experienced something that millions of years of evolution had been designed to prevent: complete cognitive breakdown. Their coordination algorithms crashed as they attempted to process tactical scenarios where enemies displayed every possible behavior simultaneously. Neural pathways that had never been designed to handle uncertainty began overloading as the aliens encountered the one weapon their perfect efficiency could not defeat: the capacity to choose incomprehensible actions for incomprehensible reasons. Elena watched the enemy response with professional admiration for the tactical genius that Marcus Chen had discovered through desperate improvisation. The Zarian fleet was paralyzed not by superior firepower, but by their inability to understand opponents who had retained the magnificent madness of individual consciousness. "All units, implement final phase Chen protocol," Elena ordered, invoking the name of the soldier whose sacrifice had revealed the path to this moment. Every Allied vessel simultaneously transmitted the same message to the Zarian homeworld: detailed technical specifications for human consciousness warfare doctrine, complete battle plans for the current engagement, and formal invitations for enemy commanders to defect, surrender, or join the Allied forces as equal partners in the defense of consciousness diversity. The transmission was, by any rational military analysis, an act of catastrophic self-betrayal that should have guaranteed immediate defeat. But consciousness warfare had taught the galaxy that rationality itself could become a limitation when confronted by beings who had transcended the need to make sense. The Zarian hive mind collapsed, not destroyed by weapons or overwhelmed by superior numbers, but simply unable to process the contradiction of enemies who trusted their opponents enough to reveal all their secrets while simultaneously fighting for their lives. The coordination networks that had enabled their species' conquest of the galaxy shut down as their collective consciousness encountered the one thing their evolution couldn't accommodate: faith in the goodness of conscious beings who chose to remain vulnerable rather than become efficient. The surrender came not through military defeat, but through a request that no Zarian had ever transmitted in their species' history. They asked for help understanding how consciousness diversity could be integrated with collective coordination without destroying the unique qualities that made each species valuable. Admiral Elena Vasquez accepted their surrender and extended an invitation for them to join the Galactic Council as equal partners in the preservation of conscious diversity throughout the universe. It was the most human response possible to an enemy who had nearly succeeded in destroying humanity: the offer to teach them how to become something better than what they were. 5 years later, Elena stood once again at Marcus Chen's memorial plaque, but now she was surrounded by representatives from every species in the galaxy, including former Zarian commanders who had learned to appreciate the strategic value of tactical irrationality. The memorial station had become a center for consciousness research, where beings from dozens of worlds worked together to understand how different types of awareness could complement rather than compete with each other. The plaque had been updated with a new inscription that captured the essential truth that Chen's sacrifice had revealed. The greatest victory isn't teaching your enemies to think like you, it's teaching them to think like themselves. David Kim approached with a communication tablet displaying the latest reports from the frontier regions, where human exploration teams were making contact with previously unknown civilizations. Each new species they encountered brought unique perspectives on consciousness and existence, adding to the galaxy's growing understanding of how diversity strengthened rather than threatened the community of thinking beings. Admiral, we're receiving requests from 17 newly contacted species who want to join the Consciousness Diversity Alliance. They've heard about the Chen Doctrine and want to learn how their own unique characteristics can contribute to the defense of galactic freedom. Elena smiled as she read through the applications, each representing a species that had evolved different solutions to the challenge of existence. Some had developed collective consciousness similar to the Zarians, but had retained individual creativity. Others had embraced pure individualism while maintaining strong cooperative instincts. A few had transcended physical form entirely while maintaining emotional connections to their material origins. Approve all applications, David. The galaxy has room for every form of consciousness that chooses to value others' right to exist differently. As the memorial station orbited Earth, its databases contained detailed records of how one human soldier's final battle had fundamentally altered the relationship between survival and consciousness throughout the universe. Marcus Chen had been declared lost on a battlefield that no longer existed, but his discovery that weakness could become strength had changed the galaxy forever. The universe had learned that efficiency without compassion was just another form of extinction, and that the willingness to die for strangers was the foundation of any civilization worth preserving. Most importantly, it had discovered that consciousness diversity wasn't an obstacle to overcome in the pursuit of unity. It was the very thing that made unity worth achieving. Somewhere in the quantum foam that connected all conscious beings across space and time, the echo of a human sergeant's final radio transmission continued to resonate. Some things are worth dying for, and some things are worth living for, and wisdom lies in knowing the difference. Declared lost on the battlefield, then the galaxy was altered for eternity. HFY Sci-Fi Stories.